Okay, so thinking about then the roots and that they go out beyond the drip line, but we know that we can move them smaller because people move them smaller all the time. This is what happens at the nursery if they are field grown. They're cut at the size of the tree spade or the container that they want to put them in. And routinely, plants are moved with less than 20% of their root system, sometimes as little as 10% of the root system. And they do grow, they do recover. It just takes them longer, like that weeping hemlock we showed you. The bigger the trunk diameter, the longer it takes for the roots, which are growing based on the number of leaves they can keep alive, for them to recoup from the loss. So
that's a beautiful root system right there.
And it's not a root system that we spread out or that we flattened out. That is the root system that we dug up on that Durka. It's a native shrub, and it had been growing in a client's yard, and it was hard to find. And when she moved, we wanted to take it with us. So there it is, bare root, moved and did just fine. In fact, we moved it twice after it got to the new house. Once we got the design done, it went into a new place. So you can see this, here's on a Japanese maple. And if you look, you can see where the roots had been cut and then grew out and get thicker and thicker. There's a knob right there. There's a place where it was cut. They were cut and planted again, and they grew. Those were cut and they grew. This one right there, the reason that we cut that, so this is that seventh sun we showed you earlier, that root was twisted and curving just like this one is. This one is flexible.
We could bend it out.
We could bend it outward. When we planted it, we could bend it out, put a stick in the ground to keep it from bending back, and we'd get that nice wide spread. But this one wasn't flexible anymore, so we cut it. We cut it because if we left it there, that little root would be that root 6 years later.
And girdling this side of the tree.
This is a dawn redwood. They're very fast growing trees. And this tree, this root was a little root going around at the flare level. It's a flare root. And that's how much it increased in girth and is now, see the little roots growing out of the trunk of the tree? This was all buried because the tree was too deep. And these little roots are growing here in the fall because starches are coming down from the roots now to feed the root, from the leaves to feed the roots. And there is a girdle here. This root like is pressing.
Clipping off that hose, clamping the hose.
That's right. It's preventing the starches from getting down. So they're accumulating here and growing new roots.
And another thing, all these
roots
are just adventitious roots. You notice they don't get bigger. They stay one, they increase.
See, their diameter is the same all the way up to the trunk.
Whereas the flare root gets thicker as it gets closer to the trunk.
So the flare on this tree is down here. This tree was planted and grown too deep. These roots developed up above. Now they're not strong enough to hold up or support the tree. And we've got to cut out this root in order to let the tree grow. So take those roots out now when you plant them. Don't wait till later. It took us 2 hours, Mary and I, to chisel out a section of that root so that we could release the pressure on the flare root that's under here and on the trunk.
And still hope the tree survives.
So in the notes that we call Plant It Well, and you can go to our website and type in Plant It Well on our search and it'll take you there. You can watch the video or you can find these papers that shows that number 3, the flare, the part of the trunk that widens because those flare roots are widening right there, that needs to be at ground level.
Yep.
And then we put a watering ring, we call it a watering ring or a levee around it. This is extra soil that we dragged up from outside and stacked around so that we could come along and pour an inch of water in and know that that water settled on those roots and went down because those roots were artificially deeper than they should be in a pot. And then we mulch up to and just over the levee, but not against the stems.
Don't go up against the.
Then it's so easy to water, and watering is so important. It is critical to plant survival.
Regardless of time of year that you plant.
Right, regardless of time of year, but it's often overlooked in the fall. People plant in the fall, the plant looks self-sufficient, they stop watering, and yet the plant is growing roots. It needs the water in order to grow those roots. So we walk by with a bucket or a hose, count to 5 with the hose, or pour the bucket in. We know that all the water went right there. We water the the day we plant, we water the next day, then 2 days later, then 3 days later, then 4 days later, until we're out at a week. And then we water every week until the ground freezes. And that gets the plants through very, very well. The wider we spread the roots, the better.
The bigger the levee has to be to make sure the water
That's right.
covers that root system.
That's right, 'cause
Even though it's a small crown, you need a big levee to get that those roots all get water.
This is a perennial out of a pot-bound plant. The pot was this big, but once we spread the roots out, once we release the roots and spread them out, it's this big. And we want our levee to cover those roots plus their growing spread.
Which could be.
Keep it moist around the outside edge of those roots. If it's bare root, it's wonderful. If you bare root it to move it, you just put in a mound of soil, you spread the roots over the mound, you add soil, you do not stake, they do not need it. If you put in, if you have widespread roots, I just put in 2 little trees today that are 5 feet tall, and they are rock steady with their roots spread out. They're not going anywhere.
If they've got their roots, they can.
Yep. So even little bitty guys, these are little beeches.
They're not a year out of grafting, maybe.
I think they were 18 months.
18 months. Okay.
Yeah. And if you took them out, a lot of people would just plant this.
Just stick it in the ground.
But you know it's a tree, even though it's a grafted tree, it's a tree. It should have roots going at least that far out. And if you take that root ball apart, which you can just do with a strong spray of water, a patient person can do it with their fingers, you can find a lot more. See the flare root? This is a flare root getting thick right at the trunk. Comes down, goes back up from the small pot it was in, laps over the top of the extra soil they put in and down the other side.
That would girdle that beech in 10 years.
Right. The trunk would try to grow, the root would grow, they both get thicker, and the trunk would meet the root out here, like that big one you saw on the ground, and kill the tree.
Can't go anywhere.
There you are, 6 years down the way, 7 years down the way, and your tree is failing, and you put all that time into it, and you could have just straightened them out when you planted them.
And you don't see some of those issues until the 5, 6, 7 years down the road.
Yeah, they're not always. Sometimes they're apparent.
Sometimes it's apparent right away. Yeah.
So we spread them out. We find those roots and untangle them, and spread them out. If we can't untangle them, we cut them.
We cut them. Yeah.
But you get a lot more root. Those trees, we put them in the ground in the springtime. They didn't grow that year. Woody plants don't. They've already grown for the year. The next year they grew about 4 inches. The year after that, they grew 3 feet.
And they're ready to go next year.
It's a lot more root, a lot more water gathering capacity when you spread those roots out, because they go out to the sides of the pot trying to spread like they should. And once they get to the side, they circle. There are some pots that have clever little ridges along the side to try to keep them from circling. But if they have no place else to go, they go to the sides. And then since there's more water below, they go down to the bottom.
And they go down. And
can you see the pot there? On this new little shrub, you can see the shape of the pot. The roots went down and around and back up again. I'm going to release them from the base, untangle them at the base, or cut them, and look how wide they're going to spread to the side. That shrub took like nobody's business, but if we put it in the ground like it is up above, all of the water that you put on the surface would do nothing for it.
If you've made a levee out here, it just misses it.
Yeah, it needs the water down where the root tips are, and they were all trapped at the bottom. This is a little 4-inch shrub, was in that pot, and the trunk was stuck all the way to the bottom
All
of the
the
pot.
way to the bottom of the pot.
Because growers are doing it wrong. We'll look at Plant It Well, and you can understand a little more why. All of those roots were wrapped around the plant, wrapped around the outside of the pot. Perennials, when we move them, we divide them and we spread the roots out. These daisies look like they're far apart, but their roots almost touch. This root almost touched this root. And that root spread is as wide as they're going to be the next year.
They will fill that space.
Yeah, and you can see that each one has its own levee around it. Even once we put mulch on it, that levee is there and we can walk by and water them real quickly. Now, some plants I divide out of self preservation.
Yeah, big grasses.
Yeah,
grasses.
This is one of the miscanthus grasses. And not only is they're just trouble to try to get out, but this one is against the foundation of the house. And if you tried to lever it out of there, you'd have the chance that you'd be breaking some siding pieces.
Which, not a good idea.
Yeah. So when we're moving something big like that in the fall, just like a woody plant, we know we can't take the whole root system. So we cut it down so we can see what's going on. So I'm chopping the whole thing down. And then I take a pie-shaped piece out of it. I cut, and it's hard to cut the first cut. Jump on the spade, or maybe you get an axe, but you slice and then slice in a pie shape. Once you take that first piece out, the rest of it slices into pieces a lot more easily.
Yeah, it's still not super easy, but it's easier.
And because you're not taking the whole root system, this plant would have too little root to make itself that big. But if I take this V out of it, it has enough place to grow roots along all sides of the V that it will be as big as the mother plant, even though it's only a sixth of the plant right now.
Yep.
And it's a good time in the fall to move things bare root, because then you can get the weeds out of things, like weeds in your iris bed. Take the plant out, turn it upside down.
You can figure out where the weed roots are.
Pull the weed roots out of it.
And they slide right out when there's no soil holding them.
When you turn it upside down and pull the roots out from underneath the plant, the weed can't resist. It just slides right out. Then you're putting back in just the plant that you want to grow. I have notes up here, but I have to make this menu go away. The menu. If you have to put things on hold when you're replanting, I put that ginkgo on hold. I dug it up in April and couldn't put it back for about 3 weeks. So I put it behind the garage, put mulch over the bare roots, put fabric, had it on fabric so I could slide it over there, propped it up so it wouldn't fall over, and said, stay there. And it did. And you saw that it moved. Sometimes they're only on hold for a little while. I moved these painted ferns out of the way in order to move a new tree into the space up here. Tied the hostas back out of the way, moved the ferns. And since it was all done in a day and a half, I could just put the ferns, stop doing that, computer. I could start.
It's mine. It doesn't listen to you.
I could put the clumps of fern on a tarp and just say, wait there, and put them back in right that same day. But at Hamilton, at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Ontario, the gardeners were redoing a perennial bed, and they had all of these perennials clumps up in the fall and didn't finish prepping the bed. So they just they pulled them in tight, covered the whole bunch with a bunch of mulch, and put them in the spring.
Yep. And they were ready to go.
They hold. This is at
Betty Ford Alpine Garden in Denver, and not Denver Vale.
They were remaking a bed, and you can bet that the gardeners were looking at the people that were doing the remaking and the irrigation system going, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. But all of these plants in pots or just bare root, many of these plants are one of a kind. They're probably worth $50, $75, $100 or more each.
And
they're sitting there in various clumps, and they will be fine as long as it's cool and you keep them moist if they start to dry out. When we divide things, we try to divide all the way down to bare root, because it's amazing the weeds that you can take.
You can find the weeds, you get rid of any weed seed that might be mixed in there with the soil, you get rid of some pests that might be there. So divide them, rinse them off, put them in bare root. It's easier to put. You don't even have to make as big a hole. If you're not bare root, so I'm planting a locust tree here at the library where we volunteer the second Wednesday of each month. If you'd like to come and help us garden and learn what we're doing, come on. Second Wednesday of each month at Waterford Township Library. You can come. You don't have to be a member. And if you want to come just for our education session, which is after gardening, you can come. Contact the library. They'll put you on the list and let you know what's coming up when. So, but it is fun.
When you put in a tree in the fall, this one's just been put in the fall, and we're protecting it from the deer.
That is not staked.
It's not staked. Well, it is in effect, because it can't very well fall over.
It can't fall completely over, but it's not nothing's holding the trunk.
Nothing's tied to the trunk. The tree is standing up just fine on its own. The reason the stakes are around it and the rope is around it is to keep the deer from beating it up. We've learned
bucks tend to really like young trees to rub their antlers on.
Yeah, and we've learned that that if we prevent them when they put their head down to rub from being able to get a good swipe upward, then we can usually stop them from beating the tree. Those trees went in with that's an adventitious root, and we chose to leave some of them on and just put the tips of the root into the ground to get some moisture, because the flare roots had been pretty bound up with each other. and we spread them out. So we kept an adventitious root, which will stay there, and it'll be a prop root. It'll just be a funny looking root sticking out. That's all right.
Yep.
This is another one of them that had 3 flare roots that we kept, and just
three
3 adventitious roots that are growing right there. And we're hoping that you will learn to do this too, because it happens to all woody plants now. They're all planted too deep. Perennial plants get root bound just as well as the woody plants do. I seem to be showing the same picture again. Oh, and remember that those roots, so those adventitious roots, those are adventitious roots that were left on and buried because somebody didn't realize, and in burying them missed the real flare root situation that was going on, missed seeing by rinsing off the soil that they had a flare root wrapped right around the trunk. So if there are any questions, we'll take those, and then we should have time to get to what we did today.
6:47.
Yeah, we do. What questions do we have about fall planting and transplanting?
Well, we got a couple. One is, do you recommend amending the soil when planting trees, shrubs, and perennials?
We do not.
It has to grow in that soil. Look how far the roots went out on some of those trees. If you amend it, it's going to stay. If it's okay. If I got a chance to sit at a Dairy Queen, all you can eat, you're going to stay there. You're not going to spread around type thing.
Roots grow where there is moisture and nutrient. And if you chose the plant to grow in your native soil, it's going to get a very big root system a lot further into your neighbor's yard. It's going to have to grow in your soil. So we add air, and we'll show you a picture of that. We add air by loosening the soil, but we don't amend the soil with anything other than organic matter.
Organic, we might add some composted mulch.
Yeah, we certainly add mulch and leaves all the time.
Mulch and leaves, not necessarily compost, but there are occasions, if you want to call that an amendment, but we don't add fertilizer. The trees were fertilized in the nursery.
Yeah, they have all they need for the year. What they're trying to do now is store it. Everything they had for this year, they're trying to store for next year.
And it's just more.
Okay. Is it harmful to bare root a B&B, a bald and burlap tree, when planting?
Nobody's surveyed these plants and asked the plant how they feel about it. But the experts that we respect, who have written the books, look at our Planted Well material, and you'll see their names, and you can look up their books. They say that the trees are better when you do bare root, even bald and burlap, because as you'll see in what we're going to show you in the container plants we planted today, they get root bound in a container before they're put in the field.
Sometimes, yep.
So does it harm the plant? I'm sure that the plant would say, hey, stop messing with my roots. But the plant is not looking 10 years down the road, or 20 years down the road, or 50 years down the road.
And the plant recovers most of the time quite well.
Yeah, they take off growing. Sometimes we lose them, but it was
not very often.
Yeah.
Okay, Elizabeth asks, we have a serviceberry tree that was 8 foot tall when planted. It came in about a 16-inch container. It was planted 5 years ago and hasn't grown.
Guess why?
You can still dig it up.
Yes.
You'll have to do some heavy root pruning with loppers probably, but you can still dig it up. We've dug up ginkgos that were in 10 years, dug them up, cut the roots, spread them out, put them back in again, and had the trees take off. Sometimes they don't make it, but it's either that or you sit there.
But you're losing the plant anyway.
Yeah.
It's frustrating you. It's been sitting for 5 years, not performing.
Yeah.
And so why not take another year to see what happens?
Yeah.
Tip
it out. You'll probably find it's still in the same pot. You won't have very much root to move out.
There might be 1 or 2 that escape.
But sometimes by the time they've been in 5 years, the roots are pretty thick, and you do need to take loppers to cut them, or a chisel.
Saw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, on that same kind of note, do you dig up a tree that has been planted too deeply?
Yes.
Yes.
Unless we can't. There's a paper bark maple and a dawn redwood at a client's property that they were too big for us to dig up, and we did not want to hire somebody to try to dig them up for us. So we lowered the area around them. We made a gentle slope all the way down to the right level and took all that soil out.
Some people can have air spaded around. The Toledo Botanic Gardens had an alley of little leaf linden that were too deep in the ground and starting to girdle. So they had some arborists come in with an air spade and blew the roots clear so they could see where the girdling was. And you could see the difference in the trees in the 5 years, 10 years.
An air spade is an air compressor with a fitting on the end that makes the air swirl around, comes out in force, and it also swirls and it moves the soil away. It makes a huge mess.
Dirty.
I mean, dirt goes everywhere.
You better wear shields.
but it's easier than using a trowel, and you don't scrape so many.
And not
roots.
as messy as water.
Yeah. Yep.
And could you give that watering schedule again? The planting day, the 1 day after, 2 days after, 3 days after, etc.
We call it our 7-day watering scheme. We water the day we plant. We water the next day. We wait 2 days and water. We wait 3 days and water. We wait 4 days and water.
Wait
5 days and water.
Wait
6 days and water. And now you're on a weekly schedule, and once a week we go out and fill that
for at least the first year.
Yep.
At least.
And so until the ground freezes, if it's fall planted, and we'll
keep watering it in the spring too. It's a new plant.
We've told people that when we plant, I'll tell them put 2 gallons of water in here, because people think that they can just splash water on it. I go, no,
you can't go by with a hose and go think you watered it.
I've measured that it takes half a bucket. So put 2 gallons in.
At least.
And how can you tell the difference between the adventitious roots and the flare roots?
Look at where they join the trunk of the tree or the woody plant. If they flare out, if they get bigger as they get to the trunk, as opposed to staying the same diameter coming out of the trunk, they are a flare root.
If it stays the same diameter, it's adventitious. And sometimes it's very difficult. It really, truly,
especially when they're quite young. But we showed you some pictures. We've got some more if we can get to them here on today, and we can show you where they are. Adventitious roots are adventitious means growing at a place you don't expect. And adventitious roots on trees and shrubs are usually above the flare. You have a group of roots that are flaring out, and you have a bunch of adventitious roots that grew from the trunk.
And for reasons that the trunk is covered with soil, and the cells of the tree in the bark say, wait a minute, I shouldn't be bark, I should be root. And they actually do start producing root. And
sometimes the original roots are subjugated by those adventitious roots. And so the same thing happens as that Dawn Redwood we show you. Roots begin to pop out above where the carbohydrates can't get down into the roots because they're too cramped.
Because it says, I need more root.
Okay, that looks like that's I got one more question. What happens to those trees that landscapers plant high, usually in places with wet, heavy soil?
Well, they're planted high, but they're still buried in the container, most likely.
Yeah, quite often they're planted high, but have never had their roots looked at all. Sometimes they're still in the cage.
And then they add the volcano mulch to it.
Yeah, so they girdle as often, maybe even more often than any other plants.
And we've had pictures of them that were planted high and it survived. 20 years later, a spruce blew right over and only one root made it out of the root ball.
Yeah, they're not the long-lived plants they should be.
Trees should live 100
at least.
How long can bare roots be exposed to the air without drying out?
Well, our ginkgo was out while I was bare rooting it and then moving it over to the garage. It had to be hours that those roots are out. It depends on the day
and the tree.
If the plant is dormant and not using any water right now through its leaves, then maybe a little bit longer.
We bare rooted that
we bare
Seven Sun. I mean, look, and that was
in August.
How many? Full leaf. It had to be a total of 3 hours. 3-4 hours it was exposed completely by the time we got it over. And
most of us have heard that whole thing about don't let the hair roots dry out. Look, the hair roots, the actual ends of the roots are tiny. They're so tiny you can't believe it, and they dry out right away, but new ones grow
extremely
well. Keep it cool, keep it moist. Bare root plants that are shipped around by places like Michigan, Relief of Michigan, are plants that are kept cool and dragged around for 2 weeks before they get to where they're going and before somebody plants them.
And that picture we showed, how long do you think they were sitting in the sun when they're using a camera that has an exposure for 2 minutes before they can take that picture?
Yeah. and there are the whole things that when they're drying out, or when you think that they're drying out, just put them in a bucket of water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
let them absorb water.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we have.